Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the OMNIA Performance Podcast. I am Fergus Crawley, and this is...
I'm Jonny Payne.
And this is...
Phil Price.
And Phil Price is a very clever man. Much cleverer than you or I in many ways.
Well, wait.
In many ways.
Okay, yeah, I agree.
In many ways. But excitedly, Phil is coming on board as a consultant with OMNIA to better utilise, not better utilise, but to utilise... He's already been well utilised at St Mary's, Twickenham, but we are also going to utilise him for his expertise in strength and conditioning and biomechanics. But more on that very soon, as some housekeeping requests from you all. First of all, as we have a very handsome, very tall, very jacked guest with us, please do make sure to hit follow or subscribe on whatever platform you are listening on. Please do rate or review the show, and do make sure to share this episode or your favourite episode previously with a friend, as that is the best way for all three of us, handsome gentlemen, to be shared with your friends, obviously.
Wait a minute. Are we sharing handsome gentlemen with friends here? This has gone deep quick, isn't it?
What have I signed up to?
You know what happened? Yeah. You know what happened? Phil was telling me how he used to do loads of work for Abercrombie, and now I've called him handsome in front of everyone, and now I need to confirm to ourselves for our own egos that we too are somewhat in this category.
Let's ensure that the listeners know that we are also handsome.
That's
and
that.
Nobody is.
You get it.
Nobody is being shared.
Okay. Yeah, that key detail.
Yeah.
Good introduction, Fergus. Anyway, Phil Price is about to introduce himself. So why don't you do that, Phil?
Yeah, cool. So I've been working at St Mary's University for over 12 years now, where I've been teaching on the strength and conditioning and started off with the strength and conditioning and the sports science degree, but since the programs that St Mary's have developed, I predominantly teach on sort of the MRes, and we do a master's in biomechanics. So what I teach on seems to be quite spread quite worldwide. On top of that, I guess from a academic or a research point of view, my PhD is actually in bioengineering. I know we were talking about it earlier, where I did mathematical modelling of the knee, and since then I've kind of got involved with several different more biomechanical type projects. Like we have PhD students at the Royal Ballet. I'm also involved with a project where we're looking at exercise with astronauts in microgravity, which you may have seen on.
I did enjoy that a lot.
On social media.
So niche.
Yeah.
Niche.
So that's still going. So I'm very heavily involved with that project as well. But on top of working at St Mary's, I also run a podcast called The Progress Theory. So obviously anyone at home that wants to follow that as well, at The Progress Theory, where we've obviously had both you two on. And what I did from the end of season 4, we had Jonny on. And one thing I really noticed, that I really enjoyed the idea of hybrid training, but at the same time, it seemed to be something that was really growing in popularity. But there was this contradiction where what I was seeing in the training space, you had, like yourself, were doing, things involving lifting heavy loads, but you're also running marathons. But there's this preconception that strength and endurance couldn't really mix together. The whole, it will kill your gains, whatever catchphrase that you want to use. So I was like, well, how come these two don't really mix? So I wanted to look into that in a bit more detail. So season 5 of the Progress Theory, that's what I focus on. I focus on hybrid training, and I wanted to speak to as many different people as possible, from strength coaches, endurance coaches, coaches in general, athletes, scientists, because to really get an overview of what is going on when you combine two things which appear very separate, is to speak to many different people that have different ideas on the subject. So that's what I've tried to do with that, and that kind of led me to you guys. Obviously, we worked together with Human 24, and we spoke at PerformX, didn't we?
Yeah.
And since then, we noticed just how much our interests aligned. And I come from more science background, you come from more practical background, and it just meshed really well, didn't it?
You legitimise us, Phil. You legitimise us, which sounds...
Well, it's an interesting crossover, isn't it? Because, as you both know, that there's a nowhere near, and I wouldn't even want to climb up in the same pole as Phil here. But there's an academic background with me as well, with the strength and conditioning stuff. And it's always very interesting to speak to people. Usually, you'll probably agree with this yourself, Phil, in that academic world, the separation from the practical application is huge. It's a chasm, isn't it, normally? And that quite often the scientist or the research is done in a vacuum, in a sense, isn't it? And then the actual practical application of that, how that's actually married with real-time training or performance results tends to be almost like this kind of concurrent division, quite far between the two. So there's an opportunity, and we saw that with you immediately, to try and kind of marry those two and see if we can't dig deeper and deeper into the research and look at what we've done and sort of provide some anecdotal reports on whether or not that research, pans out, or whether there's more scope for different research, etc. So the conversation, the starting point there becomes vast for the return on it, I think.
I think in terms of the link between the research, or let's say scientists, and people that are coaching, it happens in many different type of domains, but really in strength and conditioning, you've got the scientists might be saying one thing and you've got the coaches saying another. Yeah. I think that's what it appears on social media. But if you actually got people sitting down in the same room, there would probably be a lot more agreement and a lot more collaboration would come out of that. Yeah. It's just a shame that it seems like the two sides seem to want to play off each other to show what their skill set is. Yeah. So it's like, I don't know, coaches might say, well, they're really intelligent, but they can't communicate to other people, so it's useless. And it's like, well, people have certain skills that they're good at and certain that they're not. So why don't you work together? And we'll come to a much better outcome if that happens. So, but that happens in all domains, not just S&C. It seems to happen a lot. Yeah. I think it's such a shame. I see training, coaching, whatever it is, as almost like a blank canvas, and a lot of the time they formulate the ideas that you might then start testing in a much more controlled setting. But you need to do that to get those ideas from. Yes, you can read the literature, and from that you can infer sort of gaps in the literature that might lead to certain research questions. But that's only part of it. I think if you want to be really quite creative, you really need to utilize the training and the coaching as that blank canvas to try new things. And quite often what you're doing in practice, you then do some research studies on it, and it's just confirming what you're already doing. So it's like the research is playing catch up to what you're doing in a practical setting. And I think that's fine. It doesn't mean the research isn't useless. It's just part of providing some rationale and solidarity to what you're actually doing in the training space. So
therefore,
it all works.
It should be a natural marriage, shouldn't it? But like you say, especially on social media, these kind of things are pushed away from each other. These are the scientists, and these are
everyone's competing with each other, which is a shame.
It's back to front, really, because we could gain so much from these kind of conversations.
Well, in reality, a lot of the message that we want to put across, and I know you're a big fan of putting across, is that doing the basics well and doing them consistently is one of the most powerful things that you can do as a coach, athlete, or in academia, because trying to put yourself in a box, for example, I can think of several big social media platforms that say explosive training is the only way you can get better at X, Y, or Z, or the only way you can get faster, when that's just them trying to ascribe a certain specialism to their identity to make it more marketable, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, as I'm sure I've seen certain elements of programs of this hypothetical person I'm talking about, but it's a marketing ploy. And that's sadly the world that we operate in when it comes to that. But I think our big message is we take our understanding of the literature, our understanding of the anecdotes of the over 600 athletes that we have now worldwide, piecing those two together as logically as we can, and seeing what comes out the other end. And as you said, it's a blank canvas, which means that every individual that we get will have different outputs, which means there's more information for us to work with. And then it's nice to have this conversation where we can review the anecdotal side of things, compare it to the literature from somebody who's much better versed in it than we are, and then see where we end up as a sort of general consensus.
It's science at play anyway, really, when you think about it. If we've got 600 and so athletes with OMNIA at the moment, counting back in as general terms as I can, thousands over the past 18 or so years that we've got data on. We've got data. We know what the inputs were. We know what the outcome was. We know in general what the confounding aspects were, what the kind of different variables may have been, et cetera, so we can look at that and just extrapolate as much data as possible. But then from then, we're also able to reach out to somebody like Phil now, which is a great opportunity for us, and say, okay, when we dig down even deeper into the granularity of detail here that we're not seeing on the face of it, quite so often with training and outcome, what else can we know? What else can we understand from it? Here's the stuff that we've figured out. Here's the stuff that we're saying day to day definitely works as far as we can understand. There's nothing that's kind of confusing that. This particular thing, X, Y, or Z works. What are the fundamental building blocks there that's making that work? What's, in your opinion, is actually making that happen? Right back to, I mean, one of the things we wanted to discuss within this podcast was this notion of the interference effect, and right back to those original studies, which maybe you can pick up on, Phil, where this was something that's then become, what's the word I'm looking for, almost a trope. It's become something to say that, this cardio kills gains idea comes from these original studies, which may or may not have been useful at the time, which I suppose they were useful at the time, but then because it's not being it's not being hammered out practically as well as it could do. We're not then handing that over to people in the field and saying, well, how does this work in real time? In this isolation, it's become an idea that's then become, for want of a better word, kind of bastardized or overused or just misunderstood. If that conversation had been happening across the table back then maybe it would have been quicker off the mark. But rambling a bit, Let's hear your kind of breakdown for people here, if you can. In terms of the just where are we starting off with this idea that cardio does kill gains? What's the interference effect, or how did that come into play as a concept?
Yeah, well, from what I'm aware, the idea or the name interference came from a particular study. So, and it was how we described what was happening based on the data that you collected. So, Professor Hickson. It's a guy back in the late 70s at the time. Like, he was a powerlifter, right? But he joined Professor Halosi's research group as a postdoc. But Professor Halosi is like it's like a godfather in like exercise physiology. Like, he was a runner. So in order to try and impress his new boss, he would go on his afternoon runs around the campus, but he still maintained his powerlifting training. And what he was noticing was that as he was training, his strength started to decrease. He started to appear a little bit smaller in his eyes. So he raised this to Professor Halosi. He's like, "Hey, what's going on here? I'm still doing my powerlifting training, but I'm going for a run with you. Why are these changes happening? Why am I losing strength?" So Professor Halosi then said, "Okay, well, when you get your own lab, that should be your first scientific inquiry. That should be your first study," which it ended up being. So he tried to set up the methods for his study to kind of represent what he was finding. So he created 3 groups. He had one group of athletes who, I'm guessing he got them from the university. So they only did strength training, and they sort of alternated between the squat and the leg press. And I think it was like 5 sets of 5, and then they did another accessory exercise. But the aim was to try and lift as much as you can based on the sets and reps. Then you had another group who did only endurance exercise, and they did that 6 days a week, and they alternated between the bike and running. And each session lasted about 30 to 40 minutes, but the idea was like try and run as fast and as hard as you can in that time allotted. Then he had the combined group where he just added the 2 different training plans together. So they did all of the strength training that the strength only group did. They did all of the endurance training that the endurance group did. So that's 11 sessions. And they tended to do the strength first, and then they had the endurance session about 2 hours later. But I think he reported like one had to do it 15 minutes later, probably just logistics things. So what he was finding that they actually measured VO2 max as they went through, and that the combined group and the endurance group pretty much improved in VO2 max the same. So he was kind of concluding that there was no real interference effect or effect that made their progression any different. When it came to comparing the combined group and the strength group on their strength gains, in the parallel squat what he found was that the strength group, they pretty much for the first 7 weeks, they both increased at the same rate. But once he got to the 7th week, the combined group started to plateau off, and by week 10, they'd actually decreased in strength. So what he was saying is like, okay, that area, that difference was the interference effect. Adding endurance training in with your strength training was interfering with your strength adaptations. So because of the interference word that he used in his study, the interference effect was pretty much born. So they spent like the next 15 years trying to figure out, okay, what happens when you do endurance training? What happens when you do strength training? This is from different like physiological responses.
Yeah.
What could start interfering with those strength adaptations? What's trying to blunt or inhibit them to mean that all of a sudden you start decreasing in strength? I don't think until much later where they started thinking about training variables, and this is probably not until the 2000s really, where they started thinking, rather than like, okay, what is causing this interference effect? It's actually, well, what can we manipulate to actually enhance the interference effect or minimize it completely? So I really do think that was the kind of line of inquiry over those like 20 years from the 80s, because it's like, oh, this is something that happens. Well, what causes it? There was nothing around, well, if we made some changes to the training program, it might not exist or be very minimal at least. So that's kind of like where all that was born.
Yeah.
Because you hear the interference effect quite a lot.
It's often,
but I often find it's not that
excuse.
Yeah, it's not really understood.
Less of an excuse and more of a scapegoat for why these things can't happen.
It's misunderstood as well. When you break it down as simply as that, and there's we want to be clear that we're, I'm saying, originally asked you how this kind of poor concept was born. It's not a poor concept. It's an intelligent concept and it's good science. But it's how people then external to that kind of research have then interpreted it as being the problem. If I suppose it's almost like a knee-jerk thing for somebody, especially in that strength world, is saying, okay, if there's something that's going to interfere with, quote unquote, my training and my gains and my opportunity to perform and to maintain that performance, then I'm going to remove it from my program, because clearly it's been identified as being something that interferes. As you say, if you've only gotten to that point and made that decision based on that limited understanding of that ongoing research, as you say, which is sort of evolving and saying, okay, well, how do we manage those variables? What is actually causing the interference on a molecular or biological, physiological basis, et cetera, then you've only got a tiny bit of the information from which to make those decisions.
Exactly.
But such is the nature of strength training, such is the nature of any kind of training really, is when it's taken out of the hands of that kind of research area and people kind of look at it from a slightly less informed perspective. And I mean that in not as bad a sense as it sounds, but if you don't have all the pieces, then you're not seeing all the picture, are you?
No. And I honestly think it's a great study. Yes, it has not holes, but opens up loads of different questions. But it's the first study in the first line of inquiry, isn't it, really? Yeah. So it always is going to have loads of questions. So I think it is quite outlandish how we just added the strength and endurance training programs on top of each other, and then they did double the amount of work as the other groups.
The equivalent for control should have been having an endurance group doing double the endurance and then double the strength, because it's the actual totality of the volume in terms of the actual demand on the individual.
You can volume match the two groups properly now, but doing that opened up loads of questions, which I think are really, really cool.
They're great questions, and barring, well, we can sit and pick it apart and go, well, this should have been done, like you say, the volume matching should have been done, or what was the intensity of the cardio, why were they going full pelt and seeing how far they could go, etc. Surely that's not good. But then we're looking at it from a completely different perspective. If that's the first pilot study based
in
on
the
this,
80s,
exactly, 1980 on the nose, I think it was.
I might be wrong, it would published in 1980, so it would have been done in the 70s.
The 70s, yeah. So you're looking, and it's a great study. I read it again just a couple of days ago, because when you were having these conversations, like, let's go right back to the root and think, as from your perspective, most especially, you're going to read these things and kind of look, okay, so are there flaws in the methodology? For the most part, it's bloody good. I quite liked it, but
the science has come on since then, hasn't it? Though there's more to it. There's a meta-analysis in there that sort of brings us to the forefront. But I have noticed from YouTube comments, from Instagram comments, from DMs, from sort of conversations we've had, there is a growing body of those in the fitness industry that go, well, no, because the interference effect. Well, no, because the interference effect. Somebody might have misspelled that at some point, and that was actually me.
Does that happen a lot? Like you get a lot of comments and all sorts.
Every time. Yeah.
I'm not popular enough on social media to get these.
Almost every time.
Well, neither am I. But it comes through the filter of Fergus's output. But it's useful.
Johnny normally chimes in angrily with a response, but
so that's the only time I'm on the comments is when somebody's piped up with something that's just unfounded, and you're like, well, you haven't read it, you haven't, and maybe it's a bit arsey of me, but it does the way it comes across, and we'll quickly skip over this, is that Fergus has maybe done something which is impressive.
It's always whenever I try and give an informative reasoning as to why we've put something together.
Okay.
So
I thought it was maybe
for example, when we spoke about stacking, one example is when we spoke about stacking high gear bike workouts off the back of heavy lifting. Everyone will know because of the interference effect. And then there were reference studies where the studies clearly said that the 6 hours that the individual was referring to was when the order was placed the other way around. But it's just this tendency to go, well, this says that, so therefore this can't be the case, rather than, okay, well, that's one thing to consider within a broader ecosystem of considerations. And I guarantee the people that are crying loudest, the interference effect, will have mixed vodka and Red Bull on a night out before, which is the exact same premise, but they're doing that.
Damned interference
so
effect. I'm not
there you go.
enough.
The vodka Red Bull. That's the rebuttal that I've just given to you there. But it's the same effect in the sense that vodka is a depressant. Red Bull is a stimulant. Both counteract one another, but neither completely cancels out the other.
You can tell that we're from different generations, because I'd have gone with an Irish coffee there.
My original line of inquiry was more aggressive, but I'm going to go with vodka Red Bull for the sake of argument. Yeah. But it's the example. It's this. People almost want it to be, well, no, it shuts off that pathway, therefore adaptation can't happen. What it does, it inhibits that pathway, because at the end of the day, you're mixing demands, which ultimately comes back to something I know you're very keen to talk about, which is the sustainability of an athlete and the consistency of an athlete over time means that progress can continue to happen if sensible programming is adhered to, but it's not going to happen at the same rate as a sole strength athlete or a sole endurance athlete. But if you acknowledge that's okay, and that's the way that you want to train, as I do, as you do, then that's where we are. The interference effect does exist, but it isn't as black and white as yes, no, that can happen, this can't happen, that shut that off. Yes, it can blunt it, but there's considerations and ways we can work around the limitations of the interference effect, which Phil is now going to break down the research up to date of, so that we can dive into it a little bit further.
Do you want to know where the ideas of this idea that the interference effect shuts it off?
Yes.
Yeah, it'd be interesting for people listening to understand mTOR and
because it's the AMPK downregulation and all that stuff, which was the argument I got quite heated on, because it was an undergrad student who just read that AMPK was downregulated and therefore strength gains were inhibited, but the study that was being referred to was specifically in reference to the order of training. And we've always, and as I know you're always, the research is very much indicating that because of skill degradation, because of the pathways, weight training is always best done first. And if it's done the other way around, you should leave 6 hours between your endurance training and your weight training to reduce the blunting effect. Generally speaking, I think that's right in saying, isn't it?
Generally speaking, you probably there's so many different ways you could take this, to be honest, because there's actually research supporting one way and research supporting another way. There was a recent study that came out from Northumbria this year, and they were looking at you've got strength only group, you've got strength, and then after that they did, I think it was cycling, but they did like moderate intensity, whereas the other one they did strength followed by high intensity interval training. And what they were finding is that they were seeing both these increases in the molecular pathways associated with strength training and endurance training at the same time, but when you rise one, does the other one just come down or shut off? And they weren't really finding it. It was not significant, but trending in the direction when they did high intensity interval training. But there might be an issue around, okay, the more intense your endurance training is, then the AMPK, which we'll talk in a bit more, could be significant to start to inhibit. But again, like when we say inhibit, it's not cutting it off. It may reduce it a little bit, but in the grand scheme of things, if you're smart with everything else that's happening within your training week, you're probably not going to really notice that much.
No. There's a practicality consideration as well, isn't there? Because doing those sessions within the context of a week is better than not doing them out of fear of a slight inhibited response.
There's also, if you can, we'll pass back to you here very quickly, Phil, in fact, but if you can understand a little bit, if you want from a programming perspective, or putting together a methodology such as we have, or or just simply from understanding your own training parameters, I suppose, it's worth, the key there, I think, is not that it's switching one off and switching one on. It's that there may be a sort of a blunting or a favouring going on. And maybe understanding how much that even is affected over time and therefore recovery is where the important factors lie. Certainly that's been how I've managed the methodology that we've put together is this understanding that mTOR is not just being shut off, and therefore this quite crazy idea really when you think about it, because it doesn't make a lot of logical sense that mTOR gets shut down completely by the MPK pathway. Therefore, any training that you did that may have sort of it may have involved that first pathway is gone. It's like that seems to be the idea that the cardio will literally kill the training effect. But even if it blunts it for a period of time, then the necessity of that physiological response is obviously going to fade, and therefore the other one can kind of kick back in. If that's certainly a shit way of putting it, but you see where I'm coming from. These kind of things aren't. It's a kind of a continuum, isn't it? These things aren't. It's not. It's not binary. It's not like one is on, so therefore the other's off, etc. So and I think in there lies the kind of the key to putting it together, I think.
Yeah. Well, so just to provide a bit of background, so for anyone listening that doesn't know what mTOR is, it's a kinase, so it's a catalyst for some kind of chemical reaction, but it stands for mammalian target of rapamycin. And what it does to activate this particular kinase, to activate the molecular pathways leading to protein synthesis, we need to do technically two things. And what those two things do usually take inhibitors away from that so that the activators can come to it, and then all of a sudden this molecular pathway is activated. So we need growth hormone and we need protein, which you normally consume through diet, right? And the growth factors, so like IGF-1, what it does, it goes through like a long activating loads of different pathways before it even gets to mTOR. Whereas if you did resistance training exercises, it just goes straight to mTOR. It does the same thing as growth factors, but it goes straight to mTOR. So it's much more efficient. So you need both. You can't just have one of them happening and then so for example, if you did resistance training and then ate no protein whatsoever, you're not really going to start activating that molecular pathway. But if you trained and then had, I don't know, protein shake afterwards, then you've got the magic combination to activate mTOR, and that's going to encourage protein synthesis. Then you've got the molecular pathways associated with endurance exercise. And AMPK is adenosine monophosphate kinase. So it's another kinase. And what happens is when we do endurance training, ATP, obviously the molecule that's traditionally associated with energy, gets broken down and the phosphates come off. So then if I take away a phosphate, it's then adenosine diphosphate. If I take another one off, adenosine monophosphate. So the body recognizes that. It recognizes this increase in AMP within the muscle cell. So then it activates this molecular pathway to try and regenerate more energy, because it's like, shit, we haven't got any left. We've just used it up, and this person's continuing to run. We need to generate more energy so it can be used. So that's how through that pathway we see improvements in sort of oxidation and mitochondrial performance. So the idea that one doesn't like the other, at first it's like, well, they're very, very separate. But I tend to use, and I got this from Professor Keith Barr actually, if we go back to the hunter-gatherer times, so they don't know when their next meal is, they go out hunting. And they then need to have the strength to be able to, I don't know, run up hills, tackle, throw spears, whatever it might be to, kill their food so they can eat it. But they also need to track long distances and chase down their prey before they do it. So they need strength to do one thing and endurance to do the other. And because food is quite costly, we also need that for the breakdown and protein synthesis, don't we? So the body's a bit like, well, we need to be strong, but muscle tissue is very costly in terms of like efficiency wise. So we don't want to be too big, because the bigger the muscle. So if there's the cross sectional area of a muscle fiber, anyone watching there, anyone watching the videos, okay, if I tried to hypertrophy that through resistance training, I now have to produce a lot more energy to try and generate for that muscle fiber to then contract. The body's like, well, that's harder work. I don't really want to do that. So that's why we get this AMPK affecting the mTOR pathway. It's regulating it because it doesn't want it to do too much, because the body's like, I don't want you to get too big because then I have to work harder. And it's just an example of what's known as a molecular brake. If you've seen those like balls that are like jacked.
Yeah.
Have you seen them?
Yeah.
So they have a myostatin deficiency. It's a myokine, and myostatin is there to stop you getting too big. Take it away, then all of a sudden you can get bigger than you can normally. So the body has several different molecular brakes to stop the body getting too big because it's costly, and this is just another one of those. And the reason where we get this idea that it acts like a switch is they originally found out that it happens, but in mice. So what you can do, you can actually extract through like a biopsy in a mouse and, strip it down so you just get to the muscle cell. Like, they're really technical, proper lab stuff. And you can use electrostimulation to represent exercise. And what they found is if they do electrical stimulation to represent resistance training, and then they follow that up with long, very low intense muscle stimulation, then all of a sudden we get the differences in mTOR and AMPK, but all of a sudden if they increase AMPK, it was shutting mTOR off. So that's where the ideas come from these mouse muscle fiber studies. Once you do that in a human, what they're finding is we're much more complex. We've got different genetic backgrounds, and we're still getting an inhibited response from like increased AMPK, and it does inhibit or regulates mTOR, but it wasn't switching it off like in the mouse. And what's quite interesting from all the concurrent training type studies, they're measuring the interference effect in different ways. So it could be squats, it could be, I don't know, if you're stuck in one of those chairs, an isokinetic dynamometer, and you're doing a maximal voluntary contraction in one muscle. These are all different ways to try and determine the effect of the interference effect in a way, but they're all technically quite crude. So at the very, very human, like muscle level, if we took biopsies, you probably find that this response is quite high. The interference effect is actually quite high. But the more you move away from that to like single muscle exercise or single joint exercise, all the way to something global like the squat, it's very much diluted because there's so much other things that can affect that. Skill, for example. So, and even at the very muscular level, if you think about the what you get from a biopsy, you've got the muscle cell, but you've also got lymph cells, nerve cells, blood vessels. You've got so many other different cells that resistance training affects in different ways, especially like nerve cells. So we're thinking like, okay, we've got this molecular pathway that affects one of these cells. How does that then influence how we squat? Well, no wonder we're not seeing results in concurrent or hybrid training studies that are similar to at the muscle level, because they're measuring two different things. You can improve you could have probably high level of interference effect at the molecular level, but still improve your squat the same as a strength only a resistance group.
So what are the, for any coaches listening, for anybody that is obviously fascinated by the literature, as to make clear from anyone commenting and opening a discussion with us online, very keen to make sure that we're obviously very open to the discussion, but the general consensus of the interference exists, therefore this can't be the case, is something that I'd encourage people to move away from as consideration, because it's much more complex than that. So given that complexity, what are the baseline, top line considerations for people based on the literature and your understanding of it to date? What are the things that actually matter for people to understand, and what are the things at this stage that don't really need too much attention?
Okay. Because what I just described was just on a molecular level, I reckon there's other things that can affect or contribute to the interference effect, more so than just the molecular level. So like fatigue, for example. And we all know, like, if you do a really hard session in the morning, you're probably going to have some form of residual fatigue that's going to affect your performance in the session that comes second in the day. So fatigue is a key thing there. So clearly we want to think about how we're training, and then, okay, do we want to separate things to make sure that we are removing our residual fatigue? are we allowing our molecular pathways to kind of calm down before we start our next session, so we get less of a chance of a interference effect happening that way. In terms of the molecular side, the mTOR can be elevated depending on the session for up to 18 hours roughly post-session. So that's quite a long time where the body's clearly trying to repair itself in a way.
Yeah.
With AMPK, because it's only activated when it recognizes like an increase in ADP or AMP, as soon as you stop exercising, you stop the requirement for more energy to be generated. So that goes down really quickly. And they say is like, well, the more intense, the more AMPK is going to be elevated after, but you'd like to think it'll be down by back to baseline levels within 3 hours. So, that's only 3 hours. Usually it's down to baseline by like half an hour after your session. Yeah, so in terms of the molecular point of view, and you just separate them well enough, there's likely not going to be much of a crossover.
That's where I was coming at it with the timing.
And that's when fatigue is more of an issue, because the fatigue is probably going to be lingering more after an endurance session rather than this AMPK pathway.
Yeah, that's where my kind of theorizing a much less academic level than yourself was coming from, really, is this kind of timeline of the activation of those pathways. It's like you say, is it up to 18 hours, but then you're only stunting it or blunting it rather for 3 to 4 hours, but max plus the session time, let's call that an hour, so 3 to 4 hours. Then you're left with whatever that time is left to then return back to that adaptive process. So what it might be interfering, as you say, might be external to those pathways really at all. It might be, as you say, fatigue, or earlier on you described your muscle hypertrophy. If you've doubled your muscle size through focused hypertrophy training, etc., and just maintained the baseline, you've then got to consider the capillary density in those muscles, which are kind of that's not happened yet. You haven't got that peripheral blood flow, etc., etc. So there's so many compounding things happening that you end up kind of stuck in this. Well, what is the interference here? Yeah. It might just be one of many things, mightn't it?
I read something actually was on the train on the way here that was quite interesting in terms of hypertrophy. So what they were finding, if you tried to measure, you did a hybrid training study and you measured hypertrophy before and after the intervention, right? And some people have used like a tape measure, which clearly is probably going to be less accurate than something like a CT scan or MRI. So that's like the gold standard. But even what they were finding when they measure with the MRI is that they could find hypertrophy of the muscle cell, but that in turn would then change its force producing properties, which then would change the pronation angle. So overall global muscle hypertrophy actually stayed the same, whereas the individual muscle fiber hypertrophy actually increased, but because it changed the angle which it was acting within the muscle. You see how everything is so hard to actually measure exactly what happens when it comes to the interference effect, because you make one change, that's going to lead to one adaptation, which then changes all these different things. And if you're measuring it based on, very global things, it's difficult to track. Yeah. So that would explain why we see people that, do these hybrid trainings programs and see great results. Yeah. Because the body just adapts to the stress that you put it under.
Yeah, yeah.
What are the real distilled down practical considerations then, in terms of how you should put your training week together based on what we know, and what are the things that are a bit more fluid?
Yeah. My best recommendation, I always think, is determine what are the key sessions of your week that are going to generate the most fatigue. And by that, I mean, it's probably like your really, really heavy strength sessions. It might be your really intense endurance sessions, or it might be your 6-hour Saturday endurance zone 2 session. And these are going to affect different people. I think
I'm very responsive to volume and very fatigue. I'm very non-responsive to volume and very responsive to intensity in terms of fatigue. Whereas there's people like Tom Martin who can deadlift over 90% 4 days a week. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well,
and be fine.
We won't dive into those weeds too far, because then sitting around the table are three different different people with three different reactions.
So this is turn around immediately. Practical considerations. Considerations.
But that was quite interesting what you're meaning, because Tom Martin probably never develops a high amount of fatigue from doing that, less DOMs, and it's those types of reactions from your training which are probably going to interfere with the training. And usually the interference effect is like, okay, you did something here, how's that going to affect everything you do after it?
Yeah, so I would say another consideration in that same bracket then would be to put, and this is what we do, is to put the high skill demand sessions in that same bracket. So something where skill acquisition is of a premium. It might not be something that you consider to be physically massively fatiguing or taxing, but because overall it's quite taxing, it still sits, in my mind, in that bracket of the high fatigue but high value
like a mental stress that concentrating and trying to get a skill perfect,
trying to get it right.
Anything that may influence your
I'm thinking from a combat
muscle force,
coordination,
all of those types of things. If it's something that's seen as like an assistance session, so this could be a shorter zone 2 type endurance session. It could be just, I don't know, we did some upper body
I'd call it a circa 2012 bodybuilding.com bro session, in fact.
So the overall stress from that is probably going to be lower. And because of that means the residual fatigue isn't going to necessarily affect the next bit. I really think that, so I'm just trying to use me as an example. What really causes like DOMSy type things. Anything with like a really high eccentric demand, let's say that we've got a lot of DOMs that really sort of affects the level 3 and 4 afferent nerves, which have also been linked to ventilatory response, for example. So if I then did that in the morning and then had a very a high interval endurance session in the afternoon, that's going to maybe affect my ventilatory response. So it just means like the oxygen cost for running is going to be higher. So if you give me a certain pace, I'm going to have to expend more energy to achieve that pace because of the fatigue that I experienced earlier. So I would just keep those two separate. If I did that eccentric session in the morning, and I know my second session that I really needed to hit those paces in the intervals were going to be affected, I was like, well, I won't do that Monday evening. I'll do it Tuesday morning. I've now got 24 hours, likely going to be, there might be some very residual fatigue, but it's not going to affect me to the point where I can't hit those paces. Because if you look at the endurance training that's been affected by resistance training in terms of a hybrid session, it's usually the ones that have been measured by time trial performance or time to exhaustion. Most of your endurance training is not going to be that.
So this is what I was going to say, is that in that exact case, none of the strength training we'd prescribe is highly eccentric loaded. I mean, obviously squats and deadlifts are to some degree, depending on how you control your deadlifts. But typically for athletes, it depends on your goals. Because if an athlete's goal is to simply get a little bit fitter alongside developing their strength work, or the high intensity running intervals at a track, let's say, are there to support their broader spectrum of running demands, we would tend to consolidate those stresses into the same day because it consolidates that lower body stress into one dosage, as it were, but account for the ventilatory demand in the pacing. So we'd almost be working at, like if you were like 5-3-1, you work off a 90% training max. We're almost working at a 90% lactate threshold heart rate max.
It's essentially the same concept.
So you're working at the same relative intensity. Whether you're netting the exact same result had you not done that, we don't know. But generally speaking, if somebody's goal is to become a very, very excellent sprinter, then we'd probably adjust things in that sense. But for the vast majority, it's a case of we would consolidate those stresses in the knowledge that the relative demand of that session with the lower body demand with a bit of a eccentric load beforehand would be affecting that. So therefore, the intensity of that would be relative to the fatigue of the day itself. Because then that would free up the following day for the same premise on, let's say, upper body session with a big eccentric demand in the morning and then hard interval swims in the evening. Hard interval swims, probably just the one swim. A hard interval swim in the evening. So it's it depends. The big thing is goal specificity, isn't it? And then how do you spread that out? But it goes back to what you said, which is what are the key sessions across the week? And if somebody's goal is, I want to sort of I want to bench 140 and swim 10K best time, you probably wouldn't put their high volume swimming on the same day that they're doing their big demand bench press sessions. You'd separate those things out entirely. But if somebody was just wanting to improve their swimming slightly alongside get better at bench press, then there'd really be no issue in having them doing an easy swim the evening of a bench press session in the morning. So there's no one way to skin this cat.
There was one particular study that kind of led me to this very kind of generic idea, and that was they had a group of powerlifters and then they had a group of cyclists. So the powerlifters obviously do powerlifting training but don't really do much endurance training, and then the cyclists do all their endurance but don't really do much S&C work. So what they got them to do was one strength session. Both groups did the same one, and then they measured their molecular response after that. And then they did the same thing with both groups, but an endurance session. And what they found was that with the strength group, their mTOR response to the strength training session, something that they do regularly, wasn't that high. But their AMPK response was through the roof because they did an endurance session, which they haven't done in ages. And then the same thing happened for the endurance group. Their MPK was pretty low, but their mTOR shot through the roof. So clearly there's some kind of if it's a new stimulus to you, you're going to have that type of high response. And there's clearly some kind of repeated bout effect. So if you're worrying about these two molecular pathways interfering, you're just doing a resistance training session, which is technically not your main lifting session, but it's acting as assistance to it later on. Then if you're a trained powerlifter or a hybrid athlete has loads of experience in strength training, you're probably not going to see such a response because of the repeated bout effect. That's why I try and say, okay, which are your key sessions, because those are the ones that are going to have this huge fatigue effect. They're going to have this huge molecular effect. And if you want to try and recover from that, you need to prioritize recovery from those sessions.
Yeah.
Would you define key sessions in that context then as the ones that you are weakest at and therefore have the highest adaptive energy to give towards? So if you're adapting to zone 2 work for the first time, then one of your key session will obviously be a steady state run later in the week. So your expectation would be that because of the newer novel demand from that would be a key session in terms of the response rather than the overall goals. Is that how you'd be measuring them?
I think
because obviously
so.
they contribute. There's a
probably,
crossover, but it's a case of
And from like a zone 2 thing, if they're quite unfamiliar with that, if say they're running, they're probably going to have a really large DOMS response from doing it.
Yeah, the actual zone 2 work itself might not be.
Yeah, people forget that every time you take a step running, it's kind of like a resistance exercise.
Yeah, you're taking a powerlifter smashing his feet off the floor over.
I need my belt.
Especially when you're at 1120 kilos, getting for a run. It's almost a resistance training session.
This is, although slightly off topic, but this is why, I mean, and we do this, is that if we've got guys that are much more focused or have been much more focused on powerlifting or strength training or something, this imaginary 120 kilo guy suddenly being introduced to zone 2 work, and running is the goal. I want to run my first 10k or whatever it might be, or whatever. Then we're not going to have them run. Four times a week, which we might do for somebody like you or I, or somebody more attuned to running. You're going to get them on the bike. You're going to get them to work that zone 2 heart rate in a manner that doesn't produce that overall fatigue, because ultimately, in my mind, certainly in our mind, I think we're managing that overall fatigue and that fatigue response as a premium throughout the whole training. That's kind of why we're doing it in that manner, isn't it? I don't know if I'm away from the microphone there or not.
No, you're fine. You're fine. But anything too close.
But that's I mean, all these considerations, going back to you saying that you sort of conflate this idea of interference being this one thing in anything. Yeah, but that's you looking at those mice at that binary. It's on, it's off, and then you realise that with a human you've got all this complexity and it's not on off. It's a dimmer switch, and then you realise, well, and we're not just looking at that particular bit because you've got to consider what's going on outside it. There becomes this whole mess of things to think about, which makes the interference effect hugely important in a certain sense, but also, way further down the line for most people who should be looking at it, just go, well, how are you managing your training? Have you just humped yourself on day one by jumping on a trail that you've never been on before, and then trying to do your 3-rep max back squat that same day, and you just killed yourself?
It
simple
also
management, isn't it?
It only really kicks in at a certain level as well. Like, I'd say the vast majority of people that are beginning a hybrid athlete journey wouldn't really need to worry about the implications of the interference effect until, I don't know what, it depends on obviously how quickly they adapt, until several years down the line, depending on how quickly they develop, because there will be, as you said, a novel stimulus somewhere which they can very quickly adapt to, which will be supported by the other energy system efficiency that they have elsewhere. So if you took a powerlifter, for that example again, they will have a lot of the sort of robustness and just general demand that will be able to sort of allow them to carry their frame forwards had somebody been completely untrained. And vice versa, if somebody had an aerobic base, then it might give them a higher capacity for strength endurance work once they've got a bit more of a strength base under. So there's a bit of a crossover that happens in the middle. And then when you start to specialize, that's when you really need to be clever about how your sessions are put together across the week, where the demands are, what order they come in, what the stimulus is, what the demand is. And then we approach this hypothetical term of MRV that you try and establish for the individual to determine how can you continue to progress sustainably over time upwards towards the goals that they have. So if I was to summarize, I'd say that there's more science to come on the interference effect. It probably has more fear attached to it than is needed at this point. And as long as you're working towards your goals and isolating the key sessions week by week and being sensible in terms of how you program around that, you're probably going to be okay. Is that fair?
Yeah. As an overview, the interference effect is real. It can come from many different sources, like the molecular pathways. It can come from fatigue. But for one, I think it's quite easy to manipulate through training variables to try and minimize it. And two, I think you've got to be at a certain level doing a lot of training before you really have to be clever with your training to try and minimize it. So like I'm training like once a day, 6 times a week, because that's all I can afford with time. I still see myself in that novice level, because if you actually look at the literature, it's when you start getting into those double sessions per day, when you get more than 6 times per week, that's when it becomes a little bit tricky. The only thing I think you guys probably know this more than I do, is yes, I'm only training, like say 1 hour a day for 6 days a week, but we're not accounting the stress of work that we have, because that's still a stress. And one thing that can influence the mTOR pathway and obviously affect protein synthesis is crap sleep, poor nutrition, all of those sort of things. So it doesn't really matter that you're thinking about combining strength and endurance training. It's all the outside stress that also creates like a catabolic environment, which then affects that. So I still see myself as a novice athlete and probably could get away with doing a lot of things that I probably wouldn't recommend and still just get stronger, because I'm not at that level. Whereas, you're training 20, 25 hours per week. You've got that additional volume to get to a higher level in both. And, that's where you need to be more careful than I do with my training around trying and minimize this interference effect.
And I very, very much feel when bad sleep, stress, poor nutrition catches up with me, because everything goes a bit haywire all of a sudden.
Yeah. And you're far enough down the line now, mature enough as an athlete to know those things, and you use as much data as you can to inform that. But then we go right back to that original study, don't we, and say, okay, so was the 11-hour week, 11 hour, was 11 or 12 or so sessions rather, in a week that these guys in the concurrent group were doing, in a modality that was novel to them. We don't know much about how they were managing that. These guys probably participants from a university group.
I don't know.
Might have been studying. They might have been eating, the same as before.
On the RAS, straight after.
Exactly. So
week 7 people can full send run for 40 minutes 4 times a week. To be honest,
brutal, isn't it?
So week 7 for any individual at that point, unless completely managed in isolation.
If I saw that, I can't do it now.
Yeah. So that's probably
I did it. It went really well.
To get to week 7, regardless of any interference effect, you want to find those guys, and they're obviously guys and girls, perhaps obviously studs to have even gotten that far. Because you're like, what? Good gracious, you're doing 2 sessions a week, 2 sessions a day, etc., etc. So, I think your summary was spot on, and probably there's much more to talk about.
Not significant amounts more, but we are now pressed for time as we have 2 more podcasts to record. So to summarise the summary before we sign off, I'd say, don't, as Phil has very clearly stated there, don't stress too much about the interference effect. Otherwise, you will cause the interference effect for yourself more than you originally had planned. And secondly, especially don't stress about the interference effect if you are drinking vodka Red Bulls. So thank you very much for listening.
So interference effect on interference effect.
Yes. I'm interfering so much right now.
It's probably worth
Inception.
saying.
Inception.
It's probably worth saying, from an Omnia perspective as well, or from any perspective, it doesn't matter whether it's us or not, is that if you are trying to manage all these different things, then it's worth having some kind of established routine to do that, or understanding all those parameters. And that's where having somebody external look at that comes in, isn't it? Having somebody able to look at those different stresses and how to consolidate them, whether it's based on fatigue, whether it's based on time in the week, your schedule, or things that are sort of environmental or external stresses for you. These are a lot of things we've thrown up in the air. So there are plenty of ways to skin that cat. We said right at the very beginning, a continuity of approach is probably one of the best, one of the highest priority things to have. But there are people out there that can kind of help you manage that. So it's useful to have.
We are some of them.
We are some of them. But we would reach out if we weren't those people.
I think. Nice one. Well done.
That's the best I've done at sales in about 20 years.
I'd say so. And I think the main thing as well, I think I can sometimes come across quite flippant on the sciencey side of things, because the reason I outsource my training to you is because I don't want to worry about all the minutiae and the detail in the science, because my personality type means that I'll end up changing my sessions, second-guessing myself, adjusting and looking at all the details that ultimately don't really matter, which is why I pass it over to somebody with the understanding that I have, but not for me.
Who is not you.
Yeah, exactly, because it means that then they do the thinking from a logical perspective, apply it to you as an individual, and then you go from there, and you don't need to second-guess everything because you're highlighting that bit and adjusting here and adjusting there. So hopefully that makes sense. There's more on that to come. We will discuss the interference effect with Phil in more detail. But other than that, the usual, thank you very much for watching or listening. Please do make sure to hit subscribe or follow on whatever platform you're listening on. Share this episode with a friend. Any questions in the comments if you're watching on YouTube, or drop us a DM on Instagram. I'm Fergus Crawley. This is Jonny Payne. That's Phil Price. And we'll have that as our Instagram handles. Very unconventional names, it seems. So not much real estate on Instagram there. Thank you very much for listening. And I said that very weirdly. Thank you very much for listening, and see you next time.